Around the globe, we can find different types of territorial disputes between neighboring nations, and some conflicts are not limited to two nations. That means multiple nations are fighting over the ownership of some valuable territories. The conflict in the South China Sea, which is the background for today's video, is something like that. Several sovereign states like Brunei, the People's Republic of China, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines and Vietnam are fighting over the ownership of the islands, reefs, banks, and other features in the South China Sea. Let's investigate this conflict, which has spanned over centuries, in detail. But before continuing the discussion, remember to click the bell icon for more interesting videos like this. South China Sea is the marginal sea of the Western Pacific Ocean, covering an area of around 3,500,000 square kilometers. This sea area is bounded in the north by the southern shores of China, in the west by the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, in the east by the Taiwan and Philippines, and in the south by the islands of Indonesia. The conflict in the South China Sea is not an issue that began in the recent past, and the first conflict over the ownership of South China is dated back to 1279. China was the factor that acted as the catalyst of that conflict, as they created a territorial map of its influence, including the entire South China Sea. In different eras, power of South China changed between different regional powers and colonial powers. According to a document kept in the French archive dated 1768, the Vietnamese Navy regularly patrolled between the coast of Vietnam and the Hoang Sa archipelago. That means two controversial islands, Paracels and Spratlys, which lead to the conflict, were belonging to Vietnam at that stage. Not only the authors of these French documents, but also some Chinese authors also had mentioned that Vietnam was the owner of these islands over centuries, with some acceptable evidence in their documents. In 1932, French invaders finally captured the Paracel and Spratly Islands under the protest of both China and Japan. But 7 years later, Japanese naval forces captured the power of these two islands during World War II and exploited them for various military purposes. But after the defeat of the Japanese emperor during World War II, they decided to give up on most of the regions of South China that they controlled previously, creating a power vacuum in the region. That is the point where many of the problems related to the ownership of South China regions started to rise. No country was able to define its boundaries exactly over the waters of the South China Sea, as there was no common agreement between neighboring states related to the distribution of power. At that point, China was able to capture more power with that advantage by submitting 9 dotted lines claim covering almost the entire South China Sea in 1947. The 1951 San Francisco Treaty was signed, and it resulted to legalize this imaginary line as China's officials claimed over the South China region. Today we call this line 9-dash line, and China still refuses to clarify the limits of this admirative boundary while rejecting the claims of other claimant countries. Since then, China, Taiwan, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam are fighting against each other to protect their rights within the South China Sea. The conflict is mainly focused on the ownership of the Paracels and Spratly Islands, which are located at the heart of the South China Sea. Currently, China, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam claim part of these two islands by setting up small ships, ports, and even people in the regions where they controlled. These nations follow the same policy regarding anything on the sea other than water, by establishing something to claim their ownership. The Geneva Accords of 1954, which ended the First Indochina War, offered the control of some Vietnam territories to the South Vietnam, including the islands like Paracels and Spratly. 20 years later, the victory of North Vietnam over South Vietnam began to seem possible, and China wanted to prevent the falling Paracel Islands from falling under the control of North Vietnam. China was able to capture the power of the Paracel Islands under a non-involvement promise from the United States, which was against North Vietnam. Meanwhile, Malaysia and the Philippines declared their claim over the regions of the Spratly Islands in the late 1970s. In that way, Vietnam lost their control over the two biggest islands in the South China Sea. At the peak point of this conflict, China and Vietnam fought against each other in 1988 over the control of the Fiery Cross Reef. China got the approval from the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission to build 5 observation posts for the conduction of ocean surveys, and they decided to establish one station on the Fiery Cross Reef, which was isolated from the other islands and was not occupied by any nation. When China started to build the station, Vietnam sent its navy to observe the situation. Vietnam was not happy about building such an observation station close to its territory, and clashed against each other close to the Johnson Reef. Vietnam was defeated by the Chinese naval forces and captured the power of Johnson Reef too. In 1994, China captured the power of the Mischief Reef, which is situated 250 miles away from the Philippine coast. This was previously controlled by the Philippines, and China had to go for a military confrontation with the Philippines for the first time in their history during this capturing process. This acquisition was made in the middle of the energy race of the Spratly Islands, where China lacked any significant presence. China and the members of ASEAN signed the Declaration on the Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, with the aim of reaffirming freedom of navigation and overflight, peaceful settlement of disputes, and self-restraint in the conduct of activities. After this incident, no change in the areas occupied by each nation was reported from the South China Sea until 2011. Paracels Island is totally controlled by China, but Spratly by several nations. Most of the features of the Spratly are governed by Vietnam. They own 29 features of the Spratly Islands. The Philippines owned 11 islands or islets within the Spratly Islands, and they used them extensively for crude oil extractions, fulfilling 15% of the fossil fuel total demand of the country. China also owned 7 features within the Spratly Islands. Besides that, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei owned 62 and 1 features of the Spratly Islands respectively. In February 2011, political tension started to increase again in the region, with the incident of firing 3 shots at Philippine fishing boats near Jackson Atoll by the Chinese frigate Dongguan. Then in May, clashing of the Bin Min 02 oil and gas survey ship of Vietnam with 3 Chinese maritime patrol vessels was recorded close to China's Hainan Island. In July 2011, the implementation of a dock, which is known as the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, with the participation of the countries like China, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam happened. This dock was based on the guidelines of the earlier agreement signed in 2002. Even though the aim of this dock was to resolve disputes between neighboring nations, the issue of oil and natural gas drilling remains unresolved. As we mentioned earlier, one of the key reasons behind this conflict is the availability of a number of natural resources within the region. According to the estimations made by China, it is said that the South China Sea holds combined fishing, oil, and gas resources worth $1 trillion. So, countries don't prefer to divide the region on a common agreement, as there is a risk of losing some economically important regions. Most of the areas declared by each nation are overlapping with the territories declared by the other nations. Therefore, it is impossible to extract most of these natural resources peacefully, without any military confrontation. It is said that some regions of the South China Sea contain very large crude oil deposits, and some aren't unexploited yet. It is estimated that South China Sea contains 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas within the region, according to the oil exploration activities that have currently carried out. But Chinese exploration teams predict even larger numbers than that. The Philippines was the first nation to start oil exploration activities in South China in the 1970s. They were able to discover their first oil field in the coast of Palawan close to the Spratly Island in 1976. Then the race for the oil exploration in the South China Sea began officially. However, most of these oil deposits are not at a usable level because of the political tension of the region regarding the ownership of these deposits. In 1992, both China and Vietnam offered the license for oil exploration activities in the Spratly Islands area. But some of these areas were overlapping, finally leading to the confrontation between China and Vietnam to cancel each other's contract. This South China region is important as a fishing ground to cover the protein demand of the densely populated Southeast region. There are differences between the numbers related to fishery production published by different authorities, as the illegal fishery is more famous in the region. In numbers, the South China Sea roughly accounts for 10% of global fishery resources and 14% of the total world catch at 11.7 million tons per year. Number of times this region has turned into a politically tense situation over invading the fishing grounds by the fishermen of the surrounding nations. Annually, many fishing boats are destroyed due to illegal fishing. During the period between 2014 and 2019, Indonesia destroyed 555 foreign fishing boats that had carried out illegal fishing. South China Sea is a very important logistic route, as it acts like a gateway to the Strait of Malacca and the Port of Singapore. It is estimated that global trades worth of US $3.37 trillion are carried out across this region. 1/3 of the global maritime trades are carried out across this region as the surrounding industrial giants use this as the main sea route to export their products. According to the statics, 80% of China's energy imports and 39.5% of China's total trade passes through this South China area. These numbers clearly depict the importance of this sea area in terms of logistic activities. China is the main factor that develops the political tension in the region since the beginning. The Chinese government has turned several underwater reefs in the region into artificial sandy islands with military airfields. In that way, they built 7 such heavily militarized artificial islands in the region during the period between 2013 and 2018, creating unnecessary political tension. In early 2023 also, the Philippines accused that Chinese vessels are shining lasers at their boats to temporarily blind the crews. In addition, they also accuse that Chinese boats are blocking or sailing close to their boats, creating an unnecessary danger. Even though a number of agreements have been signed between these Southeast Asian nations to solve the issues, nothing has become effective yet. Because of the race between the neighboring states for the natural resources within the region, we won't see a solution for the conflicts in the South China Sea anytime soon. What is your opinion regarding the conflict in the South China Sea? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Remember to subscribe to us for more informative videos like this.